Hey everyone, this is video 3. For this one, I chose to do the apocalyptic genre out of Osborne. I believe this is once again another very interesting topic, and also could be a little misunderstood between us. Once again, because of that disconnect, because of how we view it in a 21st century Westernized perspective, more so than a first century or even prior to that Hebraic perspective. So for this one, Osborne starts off by talking about how within the apocalyptic genre you basically have literal and symbolic languages used. Literal in the sense that, of course, it's literal, pretty easy, and then symbolic that it uses symbols. We see that all the way back as far as Joseph's dream in Genesis. That wasn't so much apocalyptic as much as prophetic. But we at least see the vision there. Of course, we have visions in Daniel. He has many visions. There's visions in other books of the prophets. There's visions, Acts chapter 10 is Peter's vision. And then, of course, John's vision throughout the entire book of Revelation is just that. It's a vision. And so we have the literal sense, but then also these visions that take place. He also Osborne begins to list different apocalyptic books. And he mentions, of course, the books of Zechariah and Daniel, as well as some of the latter chapters in Ezekiel, as well as a few chapters in Isaiah, chapters 24 through 27 more specifically. The books of, Joel has some apocalyptic stuff in it, Jeremiah, other prophets. And so he mentions those, but then he also mentions extra biblical books or books of the Apocrypha, those that are not considered canon, such as the Book of Jubilees or the Book of Enoch, or the Assumption of Moses, and a few others like that. So very interesting works. He also talks about how apocalypse, of course, means to reveal, and that, of course, is that we see the first time that the word apocalypse is used is in Revelation, when Jesus says that this is basically his apocalypse or his revelation to John. And so that's when we first see the term being used. He then Osborne goes on to talk about the features of the apocalyptic genre. He talks about how ultimately it's a form of communication, and that in this form of communication it's primarily told through dreams and through visions, as mentioned before, but it's also typically told with the sense of this angelic guide that guides a person throughout. We see that most clearly in Revelation, as John asks the angel, what does this mean? What's going on here? We also see it in Daniel. Daniel's, he has the angels there to help him interpret what it is that he sees. He also talks about how a lot of times that the apocalyptic genre is given in cycles, and that it is progressively getting worse as things go on, or as a vision is being revealed, that the vision is progressively getting worse and worse and getting more confusing, basically, to us, but to them it's getting more and more chaotic. And then he also talks about how there's, within the communication, there's also a bunch of symbols used, and those symbols can be things themselves, such as the horses or locusts or lamps, or they can also be numbers. For example, we see many numbers that are used multiple times: 3, 4, 7, 12, 40, 666. They all mean something to us, though we might not know the exact definition. For example, 666, we don't know what it is, other than it's the mark of the beast, and it's the number of man. But then there are others, of course, 40 and 12 and 7. We recognize those in other parts of the Bible. Osborne then goes on to talk about basically that even in the Old Testament, there were some apocalyptic sections that kind of explained probably what could happen in the future. For example, if you look at Joshua chapter 10, where Joshua is battling the 5 kings within Canaan, and he causes the sun to stand still, and of course God rains down hailstones onto those who are fleeing from the city, and you can actually draw parallel to that in Revelation 16. So you actually have historical books and historical lessons and stories that actually end up coming back into possible future events that take place, and he talks about that. He also talks about the characteristics of of the apocalyptic genre, and that typically it has a very pessimistic attitude towards the future and towards as things are getting worse, that you just look at things pessimistically. But ultimately, in the end, that there is brought forth salvation and brought about restoration. And even at the end of Revelation, we see that God, when He brings forth the New Jerusalem and He brings forth the new heavens and the new earth, that all things are restored, that everything goes back to as it was in the Garden of Eden. And so ultimately, though things are getting worse and judgment is being poured out, it's also at the same time with this attitude of restoration. And then also he talks about how the interpretation that we are to use when we examine the apocalyptic genre is the same way that we would look at the other parts of Scripture. Look at the Scripture in the verses in and of itself, look at the grammar, look at the words, then take that one sentence or small, whatever it is, and look at it in context, look at it in the bigger picture, look at it in the context of the whole book. Look at the symbols, look at what the symbols mean, try to explain those, but letting the Bible interpret itself. Not, once again, us adding our own interpretations to what we believe it says, but letting it interpret itself through what these things are. For example, the locust in Revelation chapter 9 that we see, we also see locust in Exodus, we see locust in Joel, we see locust in Judges, and we see locust in Nahum. Instead of us trying to interpret what these locusts are, let the Bible interpret what locusts are. And so he basically explains how we should let the Bible do the interpreting and not what we think it is, because ultimately it doesn't matter what we think it is. It matters what God meant for it to be and what it is. And so, once again, I found this section particularly interesting. So I'll see you once again in the last video.